Thanks, Millie. Thank you for the best audience in London, as usual, and the great panel. Actually, every event at the Frontline Club is late, except this one, which is first Wednesday. We're the only one that starts on time. That's not true, the way that Millie started. So, welcome, everybody. I know everyone's busy, so we'll end on time, and I have a proposed structure, which please stick to. It's not the best one, but it will get faster through things. I'm going to wonder how provocative was this video first. Then I'm going to discuss the response with you and the panel, focusing on Islamic world reaction, Muslims who did nothing, Muslims who were cross and did nothing, some Muslims who protested and there were lives lost, what were the root causes, and then freedom of speeches, what's their responsibility when it happens again, as it surely will. That'll come third. So that's the rough structure. Good evening, everybody. It's a public meeting. Would you like to give us a minute each, panel, on, we've all paid £10 for your thoughts. What value for money can you give us?
Yeah, you didn't pay them to us.
No.
Yeah, we've not been paid. Let's make that clear.
Can you tell us your name and your takeaway on this subject, please? Starting with you.
So my name is Majid Nawaz. I'm chairman of Quilliam, counter-extremism think tank. Three basic points I'd like to make to start with. One is I think that speaking as a Muslim, I think we got our priorities mixed up in this incident. I think that if, for example, having been somebody who has suffered from a gross violation of my own human rights in the past in Egypt for some objectionable political views, I would have expected and did expect that the rest of the world would condemn the abuse of human rights and the arbitrary detention and torture before saying, oh, he had bad views and so he deserved it anyway. And the analogy I'm drawing there is for a reason, which is that if people have been killed and if property has been damaged, then as Muslims our priority to actually speak out was about the damage, the murder, the looting, the pillaging that occurred as a result of this movie, and then look at the fact that this film was stupid and irresponsible. I would also say that actually, very quickly on the blasphemy law and the calls for the OIC to introduce a global blasphemy law, I believe contrary to established human rights principles, but also, again speaking as a Muslim, are wholly and absolutely un-Islamic and unjustified by the Quran. There's absolutely no scriptural basis for introducing a blasphemy law whatsoever. And finally, I think that the media reaction was slightly unhelpful and would have been much better if they focused on the popular demonstration in Benghazi against the killing of protesting the killing of the US ambassador, rather than some of the covers we saw. For example, a Newsweek cover featuring Ayaan Hirsi Ali and the title Muslim Rage, as if Muslims around the world are one homogenous entity.
Thank you on this subject, for so big as it is, limiting yourself to quite a brief time. Kirsty, same if I can ask you.
Okay, I'm Kirsty Hughes. I'm Chief Executive at Index on Censorship, which is a London-based international freedom of expression organisation, currently celebrating our 40th anniversary. I think there's a few very basic points that you'd want to make at the start of discussing the video and wider freedom of expression issues, which is, first of all, that freedom of expression is a universal right. It's not an English right or an American right or a Western right. It's a fundamental right. It underpins many of the other rights that we have, including I would argue, it underpins the right to hold different beliefs, including religious beliefs or no beliefs. So we censor that and censor ourselves at our peril. We're also in an age of the internet and mobile. I don't think that's the only thing underpinning in any way what happened with this video, and it's very interesting, as you already suggested, that initial reactions, including media reactions, tried to caricature it into a very black and white issue, as if it was freedom of speech and offence, when it's actually below that a lot to do with politics and manipulation, and not directly to do with freedom of speech and offence, in fact.
Thank you. No to censorship. Miriam?
My name is Miriam François-Serra. I'm a postgraduate researcher at Oxford.
Can you hear at the back? Sorry to interrupt. Not very well. Yes. Can you boost Miriam a bit? Could you go on?
I work on. I don't have to boost myself. I'll be boosted, will I?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I work on the Middle East. That's my research area of research, and so I write about that quite frequently. I suppose my first view on this would be to say that it's sad that the debate seems to immediately have been dominated by the extremes. It was look at how these violent reactions pose an inherent threat to our way of life, the whole kind of civilizational clash issue which has come up recurrently during these episodes. And Unfortunately, I think that obscures a much broader issue, which was that the vast majority of Muslims didn't protest in any way violently. Many people may have been offended, some very offended by what happened. And I think it would be more interesting to sort of steer the discussion towards what is our responsibility within democratic free societies towards minorities. That is to say, in every free society, we have to protect the rights of minorities and be sensitive to... I'll stop.
And we will.
We'll come back to it.
We will steer the discussion towards that. Thank you very much. Tom?
My name is Tom Holland. I'm a historian of antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and obviously studying that period I wouldn't normally expect to be here discussing contemporary affairs. I imagine the reason I've been invited on this panel is because I wrote a book about, among other things, the origins of Islam, which then got turned into a film for Channel 4, in which I questioned some pretty basic fundamentals of Muslim belief. And I had a personal experience of what it's like to be the object of a Twitter storm, and then almost got bundled up into the innocence of Muslims because Iranian TV picked up on both the films and tried to compare them. So my take on this whole process is informed by the blank feeling of terror I had when I thought that I might end up getting burnt in effigy in rural Pindi or Tehran. And the fact that I didn't, I think, is incredibly optimistic, because I think it suggests that actually there is a good deal of balance and good sense out there, and if we could emphasize that, then perhaps things will not look so bleak and not so polarized.
Yeah, I'm David Aronovich, columnist of The Times and a journalist also of some antiquity. The single point that I want to make is that in a extraordinarily diverse, cacophonous, interdependent, and now increasingly mobile in terms of people, in terms of communication and knowledge world, we cannot afford to have a situation, and we cannot live with a situation, whereby any substantial groups of people locate offence anywhere in the world, and, if you like, hyper-locate themselves to that point, looking for that offence and react to it. It's simply impossible. We can't manage it. And it has taken me back to some early and first principles about freedom of expression. And I think 6 days ago I was chairing Salman Rushdie, an event at the University College London. And it did, and the whole business of reading his book did remind me that there are some absolutes for us when it comes to freedom of expression, which we can't undercut or go under.
Thank you very much. So let's start with how provocative was it? Did anyone in the room see a bit of it or any of it? Panel included. Okay. So if any of you with your hands up, would you like to talk to us about how provocative it was? Would anyone on the panel, or madam? And we'll get the microphone to you. And I'll remind you, it's a public meeting, so your opportunity to speak starts at the beginning, not at the end. Would you like to say your name and answer the question?
My name is Randa Ashmawi, and I'm a journalist from Egypt. And well, of course, as I'll try to speak. Not to be but it's a big subject. It's impossible.
How provocative was it? It's the only. That's all we're asking.
It's offensive, yes, but that's not the point. It is horrible, disgusting, lacks standards. It lacks quality. It lacks absolutely everything. It's the person, whoever who did it, just did it to provoke and to become famous in a very cheap way.
Did it provoke you?
No, I felt afraid when I saw it for the minorities in my country. Okay. Because it was also said that the person, whoever did it, was a Copt. So I said, oh my God, all my friends Copt here will be attacked because of this movie.
Okay, David, how provocative was it? Back down the panel and then back to the room.
I didn't watch it. Didn't watch a single frame of it.
I watched it. Yeah, I've watched it, and I wasn't provoked by it. I wasn't disturbed by it. It was just crap. It was an absolutely ridiculous piece of work, and the only reason it became famous is because some religious guy in Egypt decided to translate it into Arabic and air it on TV.
And I mean, the question surely is, Provocative in what sense? Provocative to what? Was it an incitement to violence? No, I don't think it was an incitement to violence. The comment I agreed with best, I've forgotten the journalist's name, was the one who said, makes Monty Python's Life of Brian look like Merchant Ivory. I mean, it was absurd. It was dreadful. You almost had to laugh, except it had by then caused that amount of trouble and violence.
47 people died within 2 weeks, so I mean, no one was laughing. So why were they...
Not by then,
Right,
no.
but it was provocative, but you say not to you. No one's yet been provoked by it in the room. Were you provoked by it?
Actually, it's really interesting that nobody here was provoked by it, and perhaps that's quite telling about our circumstances as compared to those people in the Middle East and their situation. That might be more indicative of why they felt provoked. But the more important
Were you
question
provoked
is...
by it?
I haven't watched it. I haven't felt the need to watch it, and I'm not really interested in it. But it was designed to be provocative.
Right,
Let's not
Tom?
forget that.
I think that what was, I suppose, provoking about it was the way in which there are elements in the biography of Muhammad that can be used by the two extremes, and they tend to revolve around issues of sex and violence.
Right, can we hear Tom at the back? Right, so, sorry Tom, do finish.
There are certain notorious cruxes in the biography of Muhammad that Islamophobes will pick up on. The slaughter of the Jews of Medina is the classic. His sexual relations with Aisha, his young bride, is the other one. And both these issues were fixed on in this film and used.
Okay, and to you in the audience.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think there are a lot of half-truths and episodes from the Prophet's lives which are specifically the ones used which would inflame. It didn't provoke me, but it was pretty close to what Satanic Verses did as well.
So can I ask, is there anyone in the room who was provoked by it? Your hand is up, so would you tell us why you were provoked by it? And maybe you'd like to tell us your name so we know a bit more about you.
My name is Arwa. I was provoked because all my life I've been hearing about the Prophet in a really good light. I respect him. And when I watched the movie, everything I believed about the Prophet was, completely destroyed. And I was thinking, why would anyone want to just distort the image of the Prophet?
Thank you. Let's ask the panel to react to what you're saying, but keep the microphone.
Yeah, I think the reason why people would... there are two types of people that want to approach this subject. One are the anti-Muslim extremists, who are probably as bad in some cases as the Islamist extremists. And there are two... they have a symbiotic relationship. They feed into each other, fuel each other's anger, and justify each other's existence. There's another reason, which is a perfectly legitimate reason, which wasn't the reason this film was made, and that's an academic reason. And we mustn't, as Muslims, be provoked if somebody has a genuine academic interest in tearing apart our religious sources, as we do with Christianity and with Judaism and with Hinduism. In fact, you probably know as a Muslim, I'm assuming you're a Muslim, what we do to Hindu theology and how we completely rubbish the whole idea of worshipping idols. So we do it to other faiths, and we have to accept when academics do it to our faith.
I would agree when it comes to documentaries in the likes of Tom Holland's or anyone else's, but I think it's quite clear that the film in question wasn't designed to provoke any sort of academic, substantive discussion on the life of Prophet Muhammad. It was clearly intended to play on the areas that were likely to create tensions. And in fact, the whole story, if you recall when it was released immediately, it was alleged that there were Israeli donors, so it was again playing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was alleged they'd spent $5 million. When you consider that 2 in 5 Arabs are living in poverty, a $5 million insult has quite a sting to it.
Then you have to ask, why even are we here tonight in that sense? Why did anyone pay attention to this film? There's two different points going on here, I think, in response to you being offended and provoked by the film. One is, in a sense, what you've just said in terms of we've got to be able to debate and discuss and challenge each other, whether it's about our beliefs or about scientific arguments or about anything else. And the other is that we can't do that if we're going to say, well, for you that's offensive, we'll cut that bit off. Actually, for you it's something else, we'll cut that bit off. Then we're not in a position to have a free debate.
Why do you care?
Well, let me ask you this question.
I mean, if some guy makes a ridiculous film in his garage, there are billions of things on YouTube. If you want to find donkey buggering, You can find it. You put in YouTube, you will find a film about donkey buggering. If donkeys happen to be your favourite animal, and actually if there's some roughness involved in the donkey, this may be slightly different, but discussions about donkey buggering, let's say. If donkeys happen to be your favourite animal, will you go out and burn down the American embassy because there's been... You won't.
It is,
or will you protest about it? Or will you feel offended about it on behalf of donkeys everywhere?
You've asked the question.
It is the privilege of the powerful to tell the less powerful when they can and can't be offended.
And the audience member, Raha,
Well,
I think. The question you were asked.
I do care in the sense that there are certain things that billions of people find sacred as the Prophet, or as
Like
you know,
Christianity.
I wouldn't tell Jewish people that the Holocaust didn't happen.
No, you wouldn't. But
I
people
wouldn't.
People do tell Jews
And
that.
go to jail for it.
And people do
Well,
tell...
that's why we should be tolerant to religious views. We should have
But they
a
wouldn't
religious
say it.
tolerance and
In
not
this country.
say these things.
Okay, thank you. Because a great part of the discussion you've started. Can I ask Tom and Miriam to continue?
I mean, I would say that in part the reason why you feel offended is because you have a particular take on the character of Muhammad that doubtless reflects your upbringing, the culture that you live in. But the life of Muhammad, like all aspects of religious belief, are open to manipulation, and you can emphasize certain factors, downplay others. And the factors, the elements in the biography that were being emphasized in the film are those that are often very appealing to the more bloodthirsty elements that you get in the Middle East, particularly the anti-Semitism.
Interesting, but far too theological. Let's bring it back down to basics. It's people in the third world who've been bombed, who've lived under dictatorships, who for years regarded the West, and in particular the US, as having been and played an important part in holding them down. And they viewed the film, you've got to remember, for many people in the Middle East, it wasn't clear that the American government had nothing to do with it. And I know that's absurd, but you had preachers coming in telling people that Hollywood had made this movie,
Miriam,
and the government, of course...
Yeah, I'm going to deal with reaction. I want to close down this question of provocation, but would you just finish your thoughts, panellists, and I'm going to come to reaction. The question is provocation. Have you basically finished? You weren't provoked. You understand why people were. Can I sum it up that way?
I understand why people were, because I think there are power imbalances between the Middle East and where we
We're
are
coming to
today,
that.
which is why Western Muslims might feel very
Sorry,
differently
Miriam,
to
who is
people in Yemen.
who is in power in Egypt?
At the moment, the military, most likely.
Which religious organisations form the majority in Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and so
Okay,
on?
park that.
In what sense are they minority?
Park that.
come back
And
to that.
Kirsty and Majid, but just come to your final on this
I think
question.
that's a very important discussion. Before we get there, I'm very interested in the way we've rapidly got on to offence. I think it was Awa. I'm not going to argue with you if you're offended. You tell me you're offended. You're offended. There are plenty of things that will offend me. The question is to you and other people who believe in freedom of speech. There is no right not to be offended. There are a lot of issues about editorial. Who should Frontline invite? What should the Times put on its front page or its middle pages? But what about the law and censorship? Do you support censorship? Because I don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's linked to what I was going to say, that everyone has the right to be offended to anything. It's the reaction that, I would even say, if you have a right to protest peacefully, but I just don't understand why you'd want to protest. You're drawing attention to the film, and what does it achieve, apart from make this amateur film director
That's
even
assuming
more,
the protests
let me
were
finish,
about the
even more
film.
famous. And the last thing I'd say is this, that Muslims have to be consistent, okay? If we're offended by this, then we should take as much offence when we ourselves make even far worse than this, and speak far worse about this, about other religions, and peacefully protest the fact that Al-Qaeda killed far more Muslims than anyone else, that the Taliban in Pakistan have killed far more Muslims than drone strikes, talking about that foreign policy, and we don't. And so we're a bit inconsistent in all those things.
And you've moved us on to reaction. I'm going to move to that now. Reaction among people who consider themselves Muslims. And Miriam, I interrupted you. I'm sorry to do it, but I'd like to give you back the talking stick. For people, what were the root causes of those who protested, would you argue?
Well, I'm not saying that this worldview is necessarily coherent or even reflecting of reality, but it is very widespread in the Middle East. That is to say, the view that America and the West in general has played a significant part in holding down, in oppressing countries in the Middle East, at bolstering dictatorships. There are elements of truth, and then there are of course other elements that come into it. If you want to explain what the roots of the protests were, I would regard the film as having been a catalyst which allowed broader protests about a whole range of things, about anger, about the role that the US has played more broadly in the region, but also, of course, the instrumentalization of those protests by Islamists and other groups on the ground to advance their own purposes, to destabilize the government. There have been all sorts of domestic reasons which I think have been ignored. If we just took one example in Tunisia, there's a whole range of reasons why people are angry. This is a post-revolutionary state. There is massive instability. It's unclear what direction the country is going in. There's no clear constitution at the moment. There's huge discussions over these things. Protests are a moment in which people come together and express their anger, but it can be only the film is just a catalyst to express broader anger.
We're on the reaction and the root causes for those who protested.
Yeah, I think this argument's unsustainable. It's unsustainable as a matter of fact, and it's unsustainable as a matter of history. I mean, if this were the first time, then you might be able to get away with that. But we've had the Danish cartoons business, which incidentally during protests against which the Swedish embassy somewhere was burned down. The German embassy took a hit during the course of all this. In Pakistan, the governor of one of the major states, Salman Rushdie, was assassinated for opposing the Pakistan blasphemy law, and there were major demonstrations against him by very much the same sort of people. Now, I doubt whether those demonstrations were because he was an American or he was associated with America. I think you have to accept that there is a perception which is created and then fostered particularly by people who are on the right of political Islam, which creates a sense of total victimhood and grievance, and plays upon this grievance at moments like this in order to get a reaction. Now, my problem is, partially, we're told, and I believe this, that not that many Muslims are actually involved in these actions, and of course that is true. And on the other hand, almost exactly the same people will then tell me that 1.8 billion people are offended when you do X, Y, or Z. So I find a kind of sense of argumentative confusion about this. But the one thing I don't accept is that all this emerges from some justified sense of geopolitical grievance.
So I spent 4 years in an Egypt jail discussing with jihadists every day, and spent 13 years inside an Islamist organization. The reason I mention that is because we would sit down on a regular basis inside these organizations to discuss how to use occurring geopolitical events to the advantage of our ideology to further our narrative. And that narrative was that there's a global war going on against Islam and Muslims. If we could popularize that narrative, it would serve our cause, because we'd be able to recruit other Muslims to fight this war and defend Islam and Muslims. So there is a vested interest in two extremes to make this an issue. They are the anti-Islam extreme, as the filmmaker clearly was, and the Islamist extremists who want to stoke the fires and the flames so they can capitalize from this. I do not agree with this analysis that it's all about foreign policy. It's not, because when the Taliban were ruling the north of Pakistan, that's half a truth.
But it's obviously,
half the truth is foreign policy.
But it's more than that, isn't it?
When the Taliban were ruling the north of Pakistan, in the Swat region, there were no demonstrations by Muslims saying, we down to the Taliban, for example.
But it's a complex mixture, which is not surprising, because politics, even without religion, is a complex mixture. And the US first of all said Benghazi attack was spontaneous, and later it said it was planned and Al-Qaeda linked. Then you look at who was on the streets. Was it those in power or those who were not in power? And so the demonstrations in Pakistan were turned on and off like a tank.
So I'm coming to you in the room next on the subject of the root causes of the protests. But to you, Tom, you've been silent so far. I'm hearing from the panel two things. One, anti-Americanism, and two, radical Islamization of popular events, to try and own a popular event to try and boost my cause.
Well, I think what we haven't heard so far, amazingly, since we have two Muslims on the panel, is the element of belief. And surely the reason why there is this response is that Muhammad is regarded by Muslims as the seal of the prophets, as the model of human behaviour. And of course, there are many, many shades of Muslim belief and opinion, but I think that the ferocity of the response reflects maybe an overemphasis on certain elements in global Islam on the life of the Prophet and not on the divine.
Okay, fine. To the room. Does anyone want to talk about the violence of the protests? And the gentleman at the back, you had your hand up before. No, sorry, the gentleman at the back. This would better be about the violence of the protests and not your earlier point, if you don't mind. But it's lovely to see you again. Do remind us of your name and tell us about the root causes of the protests.
Betty, it's nice to see you. Now,
do use the microphone, novel though it may seem.
What was the motivation behind this movie as well as the Danish cartoon? Was it in search of truth? Was it to benefit the humanity? Let me tell you a quote I have over here. The rightness or wrongness of an action is to a large extent a matter of its consequences rather than the intentions that motivate it. Now, to exercise free speech by making a movie like this or Danish cartoons, is that really to bring about harmony?
Right, it's a good question, but we're not on it. What about the reaction to it? Is the reaction about anti-Americanism? Is it about militant Islam? Or is it about people who believed being offended? Can you just answer this question?
Yes. Now look at where the violence took place and where it did not. Saudi Arabia, there were no demonstrations.
In Saudi Arabia.
Likewise, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE. There were no acts of violence or demonstration.
Okay.
The countries most affected were Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, that we liberated,
right,
which left everyone gobsmacked.
Okay, everyone was gobsmacked. And the gentleman is making a difference about countries of the world. Would you like to respond to him, and then we'll go around the room again?
One thing more can I say, please?
No, you
just
can't.
one line.
No, you've had a long time, and I'm sorry. Over to you. He's making a distinction between parts of the world.
Those countries. Yeah, as I said earlier, I think there is. Mariam's point is half true. It's not false. There are foreign policy grievances, but I think there is more to the story, and that's the point I was making. In those countries you mentioned,
more to the story.
In those countries. More to the story than what you've mentioned. In those countries where there were demonstrations, one thing they all had in common is that they weren't absolute monarchies or dictatorships. They were either pseudo-democracies or recently post-uprising countries. And so the people had a vent for their anger where they could go out on the streets, whereas previously in Libya they hadn't had that opportunity to do so. And so it is also a lot easier for extremists to agitate that anger in those societies. It's very hard for extremists to agitate anger in Saudi Arabia. They'll have their heads chopped off.
And let's keep it on the Arab Spring. The people who protested, and many did not, what links were there to the Arab Spring, David, and the rest of the panel and the room? Is there a link?
No, we'd had exactly the same thing in the Danish cartoons before the Arab Spring of 2005. We had all this in 2005. We could have had this same discussion with almost the same points made in 2005. More people were killed in the aftermath of the Danish cartoons business than in the aftermath of the innocence of the Muslims business.
I think that's true, but I think there are still two links, at least, to the Arab Spring, and one is that a number of commentators from the ground have suggested that the people out there protesting were the ones who weren't in power, who so far felt they'd maybe lost from the revolutions, or if you can call them revolutions. And the second thing out of the Arab awakening is, unfortunately, if you look across Tunisia or Libya or Egypt, do you see censorship and free expression in those countries? Do you see free expression going in the right direction, or censorship, religious sensitivity, indecency, all the standard triggers to censorship going in the wrong direction? And the answer is the wrong direction.
I think there is a link, because the epicenter of this film and the crisis was Egypt. And Egypt is a country that has a peace treaty with Israel, and that has a substantial Coptic Christian minority. And the person who made this, the weirdly named Sam Basile, which sounds like imbecile, I don't know why he chose that name, seems to be Coptic, and there have been sort of hints of Jewish involvement around it as well. And that reflects the fact that there is an ideological war going on in Egypt, that in Egypt they, for instance, Egyptian TV showed a series drawing on the protocols of the Elders of Zion that probably was just as offensive to Jews as this film was to Muslims.
So we're asking about the links to the Arab Spring.
Yes, actually, I have a question for the panel, but also picking up on what Mr. Holland said. I'm a reporter for an Arabic news channel, and I covered the story. So I'm really interested in hearing what your thoughts are with connection to the Arab Spring. There's been a lot of talk about how, for example, President Morsi in Egypt may have directly or indirectly, perhaps let us say, use the kind of anger and rage as a political tool, as a weapon. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if you think that there's something to that.
Well, the honest answer is that I don't know, because it seems a total mess.
Okay, does anyone know on the panel?
Yeah,
okay, Miriam knows. You go next.
Well, it's a bold claim, but I mean, clearly Morsi at the moment is in a power struggle with more extreme Salafi groups on the ground who are trying to foist a power, if you like, from him. And one of the ways in which traditionally, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood has, if you like, brought the masses on board is by focalizing attention on on anti-Western protests. So of course this has been used in that way. Can I just come back to the question about the map and where it's occurred?
Yes.
It definitely is really interesting if you look at the different places where the worst protests occurred. The most violent protests you mentioned occurred in Pakistan, yes, also in Lebanon, where it was instrumentalized by Hezbollah in order to advance their own purposes. But where was it least violent? In very stable countries where people expressed that they were hurt, they were offended by the fact people had made this film.
Well, there were also, I mean, there were demonstrations less violent, but there were demonstrations in Indonesia and Philippines as well.
You're entitled to demonstrate. It's part of free speech.
No, absolutely. You are absolutely entitled to demonstrate. But it's quite interesting where.
But why
people,
would you? That's the
exactly.
question.
Especially when you haven't seen the film, which is very interesting.
There were a lot of people. There were a lot of. I mean, actually, a lot of the demonstrators can't possibly have seen the film, as it happens, and almost certainly didn't. And just as many of the people who demonstrated against Salman Rushdie had never read the Satanic Verses or had any part of it read out to them. So so I think. Miriam's characterisation of Morsi's dilemma is true, and what was very interesting was seeing him step up to the idea of mobilising this anger, then looking at where it was going and thinking, whoops, no, I don't think I like that. I'm actually president in this place now, not some kind of rabble-rouser. So I think we've had enough of that, thank you very much indeed, and we'll have a little bit less. Now contrast that situation with the situation in Pakistan. Pakistan is a country in which I put to you that one of the things which is destroying it as a country is its religion and its and the politicisation of religion in that country. It is destroying the country right in front of us, and it's a very, very important country to us.
Tom, next.
Yeah, well, I think that that whatever happens when a regime that has been in power for a long time and has been very controlling collapses, it always leaves people manoeuvring for position. And Egypt is, to answer your question, is so fascinating because there are so many different constituent elements manoeuvring. And this film seems to have been a sort of an attempt to do it, to strike a blow, if it's the case that it was made by Copts. And you can probably see the same thing going on in Pakistan. I mean, it's very sort of telling that the Christian girl who was convicted, who was accused of blasphemy, you know, the salient fact is that she was Christian. And I really think it's important that we do remember that religious belief is an important aspect of this, and that Muslim attitudes to Christians, that Christian attitudes to Muslims are incredibly significant.
Okay, well, I think we're just going to move around the room for the moment. I'm coming to you, but would you like to have the next question?
Yeah. Can I just put a concept, maybe the point of argument here, the politics of theocracy? This wars have been interpenetrations. We assume, I mean, I've been associated with Index since '74, since I accept the separation of church and state. You can't have freedom of expression if you don't have separation of church and state, really. In the Arab world, the poor people are represented by theocracy, and the rich people are represented by interpenetration with the West. And so they've wanted these interpenetrations, and the Wahhabis, the madrasas, the people who are on the ground in the Islamic world, they see that they have no voice in this process, and they want to make sure, they want to get the interpenetration out of there, and the way they do that is by imposing and trying to resurrect theocracy. So whenever there's an insult to the sacred and the absolute, they will go for it. It's politics.
So you say it's politics. Anyone else in the room like to come in who hasn't spoken? Yes, the gentleman just behind you, Millie. Do say your name if you want to be...
Yes, I'm Richard Lowe. Just 2 points. One is there seems to be a different level of hair triggering in the Western world versus the Muslim world, where it seems like the Muslim world picks up on what we consider trivialities and magnifies it by a huge extent, and it becomes these big, big affairs. Whereas I'm sure that, and it's already been intimated by the panel, that there's a lot of stuff going on in the Muslim world that is extremely insulting to just about everybody else, but nobody ever comments on it. So it's a very different level of triggers.
So, though you are obviously referring to the point I made earlier, and thank you for that, but I would disagree on one thing you've just said. Which
Keep
is
the microphone then.
We have to be a bit more nuanced in our terminology. The Muslim world, Western world, the opposite of West is East. It's not Muslim, and I'm a Western Muslim, and so is Miriam. And the Muslim world, even if we were to use that term, is not homogenous. And the majority of Muslims didn't even protest, let alone protest violently. And so I just think we have to be, that was the point I introduced this with, about media narratives, and that we mustn't lump people together. But the point I wanted to make was that my dad is an upstanding, hardworking Pakistani man from Pakistan who moved here at the age of sort of 34, 35 to marry my mum. And he says to me he wants to shut this film down, and he doesn't understand why it's allowed to be aired. So I can understand the anger, because he sees it as an attack on his identity. But the point I was making earlier when I said, why would we want to protest, is not that I don't understand my father's anger, my family's anger, my own identity is being, attacked. The point I'm making is, when the French banned the headscarf, I can see a reason to protest, because we want to change the law. Educated Muslims like us, why would we want to protest against this? We don't want to change the law. We don't agree with introducing a blasphemy law. We don't want the Americans to start banning videos. So what would we hope to achieve by encouraging even peaceful protests, apart from drawing attention to the movie? And that's the point I was making earlier, that our responsibility should be to actually guide a reasonable reaction among Muslims and to focus the anger where it's deserved. So, for example, focus it on the blasphemy law in Pakistan, where innocent people are being killed, where the governor of Punjab, Salman Rushdie, was assassinated because of this unjust law, where a 13-year-old girl was detained and charged and accused of blasphemy. It's absurd. That's where our anger should be focused. That's where we should be protesting, because we can achieve a change in the law there. Or, for example, in the French headscarf ban, we should protest that.
If I could just come back to the protest issue, because we're talking about freedom of speech, and of course that does include the right to protest. And
no one's denying that. No one's disputing that.
I didn't say you did. I'm just saying it includes the right to protest. And I think it's actually really important in democratic societies to see that the right to protest actually can represent a space, if you like, in between legislating and doing nothing. That is to say, I would argue that a lot of people who protested peacefully aren't in favour of legislating for blasphemy or anything else. What they would like to express is the view that they were deeply offended by what happened.
Well, we got that
there.
message, didn't we?
And
Because 47 people aren't living anymore. So the point of the question is...
Well, that's bringing in the violence, which to me
Well,
may
we
have
were
other
talking...
roots,
The violence is important, isn't it? Because the gentleman says it's a hair-trigger world. Can you understand why one of those lives was lost? Tom?
Well, I'm puzzled, to be honest, because according to Islam, Muhammad is the prophet of God, but he is only a man. What really matters is God and the orders that God gives through the Quran, that there should be brotherhood, that there should be amity, that there should be egalitarianism. And I would have thought that if Muslims had an object of anger, it would be events in, say, Syria.
Right.
Why are people protesting against this ludicrous video when they could be protesting about Syria?
Do you worship a god? Do you worship any god at all?
But do you really not understand why people see the film as embodying everything that the West does to incite?
No, I don't.
I'm not saying it is.
Okay,
That's how they perceive it.
I think the reason that people protest against the Muhammad video is that it's easy and it's fun.
It's
it gives
fun.
you something fun and enjoyable to go out and have a bust up.
But I think
let Tom finish his point.
Because what is challenging is to ask yourselves, why is this violent war going on in Syria? Why is God allowing it? What should we be doing? That is complex, difficult, challenging, and it forces you to look into your soul and to ask questions of your God. To go out and kick up a fuss about a film, comparatively speaking, is easy.
Yeah, I don't think the issue is one of the right to protest, because if that were simply all it were about, then we protest all the time and people are protesting about stuff all the time. That's absolutely clear. It is the demand which is linked to it that something be stopped, that an expression be stopped because it's offensive. We know that's really what we're discussing, and the belief, and I'll tell you why it's important. It's not just, incidentally, in the Muslim world. We actually have the proposition of a enhanced blasphemy law in Russia at the moment. And we know, there's an excellent programme by Lucy Ash on Radio 4 this week about the way in which the Russian Orthodox Church is beginning to flex its belief muscles at home in order to privilege itself and its people in Russia, creating, if you like, a kind of political caste of its own. Now, it uses belief to do this, and it is the kind of... belief is incredibly powerful, and the faith is incredibly powerful, whether the people who believe are rich or poor, and so on. And I think, in a sense, what the problem is we've got to confront is how you deal with the issues of discussing and actually being able to be blasphemous, or what people call blasphemous, in an era when there are more believers than, frankly, 30 years ago people thought there would be.
And I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's an issue we've been a little bit skirting around so far tonight, which is to say, what is this issue around religious sensitivities? And it's not only a Muslim one, and it's not, the media can exaggerate, it's not all Muslims, it's not in all countries. We can talk about Hindu sensitivities, violence, Hindu political power in India, Pussy Riot, and so on and so forth. But I think religious or non-religious, are we prepared to stand up for universal human rights? Are we prepared to stand up for secularism? Are we prepared to stand up for discussing and challenging religion? Because just one more point, what I find in my role at Index on Censorship is I'm not only often engaged in public debates like this, but we encourage a lot of debates off the record because people feel they can be franker then, and people, even in this country, feel inhibited. Let's ask Tom how he felt doing his documentary on the origins of Islam, about whether they can say and analyse and challenge through art, through politics, through documentary, especially Islam at the moment.
Would you like to answer that, Tom?
So there's self-censorship going on.
Yes, what Ken and Malik called the internalisation of the fatwa. Indisputably, we treated the origins of Islam question with a degree of trepidation and, I suppose, sensitivity that we probably would not have brought to, say, a programme on the Bible, indisputably.
Do you mind if I go to the audience next, please?
Yes, hello, my name is Virginie Lacroix. I just would like to say that there is one point that we maybe minimized, is the fact that the root causes also come from the fact that it's an internal political competition in countries with Libya, Egypt, where there have been this revolution, and the Salafists has lost a lot of attention and power, and by taking this video up, they actually were able to get more attention toward them. So it's not only an international issue, it's not only about freedom, it's also about internal politics, I think.
There's a lot of nodding on the panel. Will you pass the mic to the gentleman behind you?
David Aronovich hits the nail on the head when he talks about the separation of religion and the state. He talks about what's going on in Russia at the moment and Pussy Riot, and the program that Lucy Ash broadcast this week. The separation of religion and the state goes way back in all our cultures. In Russia, it was happening under Peter the Great 300 years ago. And actually, what we've got to be concerned about in this country, where church and state are united, what we have to be concerned about is the fact that the state can use religion for its own purposes, and that is one of the things that has happened in the course of the last year.
Just to bring it back to what we were all discussing on the issue of legislating on blasphemy specifically, my point about the protest was that it's actually a way of voicing societal concerns, and the issue, I think, which is being disregarded here is that when the critique of religion, the posing substantive, difficult questions about religion isn't really the issue. The issue begins when it's ridiculing the religion of a minority which is already suffering discrimination at the hands of broader society. And then that poses questions in terms of the responsibility of the majority within a democratic society.
Right, you're moving us to the West now.
On that basis, Miriam, what we should be doing is holding big demonstrations in this country in solidarity with Pakistani Christians, shouldn't we?
Not just Christians, Shia.
Yeah, and Shia.
All sorts of minorities in Pakistan
and
suffer from the blasphemy.
I mean, that would be the logic.
Yes, in Pakistan, absolutely.
No, because this video was aired in Egypt, and in Egypt, 20% of the population are Copts. And I think I agree with the person in the audience said that my primary concern when I saw that an Egyptian translated this video into Arabic and aired it on Egyptian TV was worrying for the Copts. Now, the point I was going to make is I challenged devout Muslims in the audience and elsewhere to think about one thing, that I believe if the Prophet Muhammad was alive today, he'd do two things. One, he'd ignore the blasphemous video. He would absolutely just, as the Quran says, وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. And if the ignorant address them, you say peace. He'd ignore the blasphemous video. What he would do, though, is protest the blasphemy law in Pakistan. I believe he'd protest a tangible oppression that's going on.
Can I ask for a briefing from Muslims in the room? Am I right that the Prophet ignored provocation in his lifetime? He was abused in his lifetime and he didn't retaliate. If we read
Absolutely,
is it correct?
That's a passage I've just cited from the Quran that if the... Yes, Tom.
It depends what we're talking about.
Okay, depends what we're talking about.
Let me stick to the Quran because...
It's like the Old Testament and the New Testament. Christ and the...
So this is a fact. There's absolutely no worldly punishment in the Quran whatsoever for blasphemy. That's just a fact.
Tom, you want to put a well in there, but don't let me get distracted too much. It was just a question. You say yes, but. So I just want to move us on. It's a big but. Yeah. I just want to move us on to reaction from the West. We were just talking down, I think you'll all agree, about reaction among people who consider themselves Muslim, and we have Muslims in the West, and you were making this point when I rudely interrupted you. Can I shift the discussion now to what should the reaction be? What has the reaction been in the Western democracies? Because we've just done quite a bit on the Islamic world, and we were told, be careful of using that phrase. So this is going to happen again. I predict it. What do I know? Does anyone disagree with me in the room? I predict another offensive video. Fat woman falls down drain. We're going to have another of them. And we're going to have, as David said earlier, a bestiality video, and heaven forbid, we'll have an insulting video about religion, possibly including Islam. Is there anyone who disagrees with my prediction? Right. What should we do when it happens? To you first, whole panel, then the room.
To me first?
Yes, please.
Right. So I don't think there's any law that needs to be changed anywhere. I think that the US, President Obama and Hillary Clinton's messaging after this could not have been more careful when they basically condemned the video and condemned the violence. I think actually the responsibility is on civil society, especially Muslim civil society, to start trying to address this narrative I spoke about, this whole idea that there's a war, there's a sustained war against Islam and Muslims when there simply isn't. And I think that we're not doing enough of that, and that narrative will only change if more and more Muslims start advocating for democratic culture and challenging extremism in societies such as Pakistan.
I mean, our responsibility is, if we talk about non-Muslims for a moment, if we want to make the separation, but everybody, will be to challenge our own Islamophobes and racists and people like the English Defence League, not as some want to do by banning them unless they actually do something illegal, but by making it absolutely clear to people who otherwise feel beleaguered that they don't speak for very many of us. One of the things that complicates this, incidentally, is that when you get scenes on the television like the scenes from Pakistan and elsewhere, that becomes more problematic. Nevertheless, you've got to do it. But the biggest responsibility here, and I think that this is the point that Majid makes, the biggest responsibility lies with Muslim leaders, Muslim intellectuals, Muslim thinkers, people who can, if you like, in those various parts of the community, create an alternative discussion and reaction. It's really, it's going to be there.
I mean, I think two points here. First of all, you don't wait till the next video. You make the case for freedom of expression and you debate why it's all right to attack the belief but not the believer. I don't think Obama responded well. I think many politicians were very late in standing up for free expression. The White House asked Google to take the video down. Amazingly, the corporate stood up for free expression better than Obama. And I really don't think it's about discrimination. There are human rights for ethnic groups too. Right. Let's protect discrimination, not censor in a vain attempt.
One, two, three. You first, the lady at the back, then the gentleman next door.
Brian Pellet at freespeechdebate.com. I want to take issue with you on that, Kirsty, about the governments being
better. Use the microphone or we won't.
Sorry, the governments being better than the companies. Google actually.
No, I said they were worse.
Sorry, governments being worse than companies. Google actually preemptively censored the video in Libya and Egypt, which was very troubling. It was showing that they were giving into this violent intimidation, something they haven't done before, going in and blocking the video from the start.
And the US ambassador was slaughtered because of this video made by a nut job. If you ran Google, what would you do?
Well, I don't run Google, but the question is...
I've just put you in charge of Google. What would you do?
I think I would have done... I would have done a bit more legwork before I actually did that. It was a really dangerous
So you would have banned it after a week?
No, what typically happens is governments submit requests for the video to be banned, which happened in 21 other instances. That didn't happen from Egypt and Libya. They stepped in and said these are very sensitive circumstances.
Keep the microphone, the panel in the room.
Just as a point of fact, sorry, that the US ambassador was actually killed in a pre-planned terrorist operation. It wasn't connected to the protest.
I didn't say that.
No, he did.
I said it.
But I think your point is right as far as it goes, that there are quite a lot of questions around freedom of expression online by the decision to ban it in Egypt and Libya. But I think Google has not received anything like enough praise for standing up to the White House and keeping it there live actually around the world, which is why I emphasised
Tom, you earlier you reminded us of the sentence, internalisation of the fatwa. Would you like to respond to this gentleman on the question of technological response, the gatekeeper, Google? Next time this happens, what are they going to... No, you don't have to, believe me, time is tight.
I have to say, it's not playing to my strengths, the issues of Google.
You've got many strengths, so we'll come back.
Could I play to my strengths?
Yes, go.
Because the point I would like to make is that just as we have to be very careful, of course, not to discuss the Muslim world as a totality, same is true of the West. Every country in the West has different intellectual traditions. The Dutch have been very, very prominent in religious freedom since the 17th century. In France, anti-clericalism has been a tradition since the 18th century. So you can see where Theo van Gogh and Charlie Hebdo are coming from there. In Britain, our attitudes to religion, by and large, have been governed by hypocrisy. And I think that bodes very well for our future.
Okay, to the gentleman in the back.
I think we just have to sort of carry on flamming in the way that probably we're all doing tonight, and we'll all be fine.
The gentleman in the blue shirt, you get the mic next. After you. No, just please
So I just
speak
wanted
into
to,
the microphone.
I just wanted to, is that all right? I just wanted to comment on the trigger. Obviously, events like this are still going to happen often. We had a woman who was sick who had been displayed on YouTube for her facial hair and publicly humiliated. And her response, I think, was completely exemplary. She just said that it was an image of her faith. She turned this against the attacker and became a great example. I would like to see how we can enable our society to do this and reduce this very sensitive trigger on some specific group of individuals.
Okay, and to the gentleman in front, this is about reaction in the West.
Yeah, Christopher Dickey with Newsweek, as a matter of fact. You know, the press is getting off awfully easy in this conversation. In fact, we're talking about very small protests.
Talk about the Newsweek cover.
We're talking about very small protests around the Muslim world.
Okay,
that were amplified hugely by the press.
I'm speaking more than I want to, but not all of us know what the Newsweek cover is. So will you tell us what the Newsweek cover is?
Well, he can. Chris
Well,
can.
I can. I mean, although I had nothing to
Don't
do
go
with
on,
it.
but just tell us what it is.
I had nothing to do with it. Well, it was a classic Muslim rage cover written by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has
a
her
classic
own point of
Muslim
view.
rage cover.
Yeah, absolutely. It was your classic Muslim rage
Those Muslims, they're all outrageous. They're all rage.
Well, no, it was the classic image, and I can tell you. In fact, I was talking to Majid earlier. I have written countless Muslim rage covers over the last 25 years. I think that they are wildly misleading.
What, your articles are misleading?
I won't say that the articles are wildly misleading, but the imagery is. And it is the imagery that the press puts across again and again that is hugely influencing this debate.
And I don't want to, forgive me if I'm being facetious, our question is about reaction in the West. Are you saying we must now discuss the press in the West? Is that
well, I don't think you can discuss this without discussing the press in the West.
Can I come in on that? Because
everyone can.
The film of mine that was shown on Channel 4, there was a private screening. It got cancelled by Channel 4 because there had been various threats. This got misrepresented by the media as being the film had been pulled, that I'd gone into hiding. And what happened was that angry Muslims were issuing their threats. Islamophobes were saying this is creeping Sharia, it's appalling, we're turning into Pakistan. And the media whipped it up and really badly misrepresented it.
Tom, that's true, although actually, like the Muslim world and the West, the media also has its various limbs and different parts and so on. But the fact of your situation was that you made a perfectly good and scholarly movie, which was then attacked by some people who were extremists in bad terms, but by some people who claim to be scholars in very, very trenchant terms that went far beyond actually anything you'd done. That was a problem too.
And I'm including them under the rubric of extremists.
Yeah, but however, we wouldn't normally think of them like that. In the wake of that, there was a threat to an event to which actually I was invited, which had to be called off at the advice of Channel 4 security people because somebody might have attacked it. Somebody might have been very few people, but that is the only occasion in the last 5 years where any event I have been invited to has been called off for security reasons. And the only event since the IRA days for any other reason other than that Muslim extremists might have targeted it.
Can I ask you to talk about...
So controversial.
Can I ask you, David, to go back to what you said earlier, would you say that we haven't in the UK then moved on very far since the days 24 years ago when Salman Rushdie was asked...
No, I think we have, and I think what we've heard on the platform today suggests that we have. And I was aware in the audience for the Salman Rushdie event, a young Asian guy stood up who said that he had burned the Satanic Verses without reading it 20 years ago. Subsequently, and in the last year, he's read it. He thinks it's an excellent book, by the way. Not everybody would, but he does, and so on. And received a very big round of applause from the audience, some of whom would have read it, some of whom not. I think such a thing was probably unlikely 25 years ago. I think we have moved on, but we need, but this is the point that was being made earlier by Kirsty, there is a self-fatwaization. I'm doing a debate next week with Media Sun. One of the things I've asked myself is, I plan to show a clip from the life of Brian, maybe from the Book of Mormon, and maybe considerably from Jerry Springer the opera. I am worried about whether or not I can show some of the mostly entirely harmless cartoons from Charlie Hebdo.
Right, so we're on reaction in the West, ladies and gentlemen. Miriam, Kirsty, and...
I'm going to come back to the Charlie Hebdo because it's actually an interesting point, but Kirsty mentioned the distinction between attacks on belief and attacks on believers, but the issue is that free speech doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a broader context in which, specifically, Pew polls suggest hostilities against religion are on the rise in Europe, including in the UK and France. Media representations of Muslims are contributing to an atmosphere which is hostile to Muslims. If we want to talk about France, Muslims suffer discrimination in all sectors of life, from housing to employment to daily life. Just recently, there was an outrage because some Muslim tourists were hushed off the Tour Eiffel area because they were considered an eyesore. So let's be realistic about the reality.
That's very bad.
But
Would you support David's right to print to show images from Charlie Hebdo?
He can do what he wants.
Would you campaign for him for the right to do that?
It really would not make any difference to me. I would stick with what we have at the moment, which he does have the right to do so. But the Charlie Hebdo images are very interesting. Let's talk about them.
No, not too much.
Well, let's talk about them because if we want to talk about the distinction between attacks on believers and attacks on belief, the images in Charlie Hebdo attack images of Muslims, not just images of Prophet Muhammad, images of Muslims. And this is happening within a broader atmosphere of discrimination. You can't distinguish the two. Do we not have a responsibility? Absolutely have a responsibility in a democratic society towards your minorities.
Of course we do. And so let's have a campaign in France that of course women can wear the veil if they want to.
This isn't about...
Yes, it is. You just said it was about discrimination against Muslims in France. Well, that's a major example of discrimination against female...
many.
Yes, so let's tackle them. The housing, the veil. Why
we're coming to Majid.
But can I just make...
And the Jew,
Thank you.
It was very anti-Semitic.
Hold on, everybody. Hold on. Kirsty next. Finish your point, then Majid.
Thank you.
No, you can't speak now. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to not lose a rather different point, because someone said we were giving the media an easy ride. So, someone in the West we're giving an easy ride we haven't talked about yet is actually the police. Because if you look, what was one of the worst examples of censorship in the UK in the last decade? Closing down of the Bejti play in Birmingham because it was offending Sikhs, and that was driven by police saying there's a public order issue here, intimidation, violence shall win day.
Yeah, I will just suggest that we do need to distinguish between legitimate grievances that exist on the ground, detach them from the motivation. Muslims, Muslims aren't the only ones being discriminated against. People of colour, people of sexual minorities, preferences, all sorts of discriminations going on, which is detached from this film thing. And I think that the victimisation mentality, where if we continue to talk about how Muslims have been victimised, the first victims of that victimisation narrative are Muslims themselves. Because we end up being unable to empower ourselves, and we are basically, then we react in self-defeating ways, as we've done with this demonstration. If there are grievances in Europe, but then those grievances, we mustn't exclude from that Muslims are often the instruments of grievances against others as well, and that the principles by which we should address all of this is through democratic standards and human rights standards. So that would mean, as I said earlier, yes, campaign against the French headscarf ban, yes, demonstrate against the EDL, I've debated the head of the EDL, but also stand up against the blasphemy law, stand up for the right of people like David to actually show those images. I'm leaving for Pakistan in 3 days, and I'm saying that, and I'm not sure what the reaction there will be, but we have to, Muslims have to start being a bit braver about these things and not just peddling a one-sided narrative that we're always the victims, when actually we're not. Because Catholics in Europe often say that they're victimized, they can't wear a cross. Christians say they need blasphemy laws because the secular establishment is preventing their right to freedom of expression. Everyone's peddling this victimhood narrative, and it doesn't help anyone, I think.
Could I present a slightly more positive take on this? It's absolutely true that there are, of course, extremists on both sides, the extremists that cancelled, for instance, the screening of my film, and the extremists on the other side who would regard all Muslims as potential terrorists. And they are the ones who tend to generate the headlines and to monopolise a lot of press attention. But in the middle, what is happening is that this is generating dimensions of debate that is incredibly positive and exciting. And I speak as someone who has just made a film about the historiography of monotheism in late antiquity. Now, that's not something I suspect that would have got on television 10 years ago, but it is now generating. These are dimensions of interest and cultural relevance that are becoming ever more fascinating. And there is a sort of inner terrain where people can meet and discuss these, as we are discussing now. And I think that is a huge positive.
My name is Roger Alsop. I think we should react, we in the West, towards about this film.
You have to use the microphone.
By reading a good translation of the Quran in English, not forgetting the verse of the sword.
So you want us, as a reaction, to translate the Quran into English?
It's already to read it, to read a good translation.
Have you read it?
Yes.
And what could you tell us about your reaction since reading it to your reaction before reading it?
It seems to me to be intrinsically warlike, I'm afraid.
A warlike book?
Yes.
And like the Old Testament is to Christians, sometimes smiting people
More
all over
so.
the place?
More so.
More so. All right. Well, that's a remark that you could come back on, except not yet. So let me just not get sucked into that at the moment. We're talking about the question of the freedom of expression in the West. Panel, have you finished this question of the press, which was raised by the gentleman here? Yes. Okay, fine. To you, sitting next to the lady who asked a question earlier, you, not you, no, you, yes.
I'm just wondering if there is any form of censorship that you think is okay.
Great question. That's enough. Go, Kirsty.
I think in very limited cases. I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that you can censor in cases of national security. There's a whole set of issues around defamation and libel, and in cases of public order. But I think they have to be extremely minimal. And I think if you look at most, even in the 1930s in Nazi Germany, to take one example, there were laws against anti-Semitism. That wasn't the protection, and therefore censorship. That wasn't the protection you needed.
So the law has very clearly, basically, endorsed censorship when it comes to defamation of character, of the living and not of the dead. And this is where Muslims often get it confused. They say, well, I can't insult your mother, but you can insult my prophet. Well, actually, the reason is because there's a very legitimate reason why it's okay to defame the dead. And that's for purposes of historical inquiry. As a Muslim, I've got every right to say Jesus was not the Son of God without some nutter Catholic coming at me with a crusade and a sword, yes, they did happen, and try and chop my head off. So the point is that you're okay to defame the dead because of historical inquiry, because of academic research, whereas the living suffer tangible harm. If I went around saying that somebody's mother was a Charlotte, a whore or whatever,
she might have been called Charlotte.
Yes. So they would, they suffer physical, results of that slander, of that defamation. So I think that there's a reason why the law does that.
Miriam, the question is, would you censor anything?
Yeah, very briefly. I think the laws that we have already are perfectly fine, and you mentioned some of the exceptions that exist. The only issue I would take is with the notion of public order and maintaining public order. That typically in law, and this is recognised by those who study the law, is skewed in favour of the majority. So public order in a majority Christian society would be skewed towards Christians. In Muslim countries, it's skewed towards Muslims.
That's completely
the issue,
wrong.
Not true. That's
It's completely.
It absolutely is true. That's why there have been rulings
We've
in
increased
Turkey that have
censorship in
favoured
the UK, an increased inability to protest by ordinary Britons who may be of no faith, restricting our right to freedom of assembly, our right to say what we like on Twitter, nothing to do with religion. So there are big problems we all
two
face.
different points.
My
point
it's all
is
about
that
censorship.
I didn't call for censorship. I said there are already laws in place that I think are perfectly fine.
Christian Britons were all right. I said
I
that
didn't.
Britons
I didn't
are
mention
not
Britain.
all right.
I didn't mention Britain because I don't even know if we
Christian
could.
majorities. Then you said
And
were all
England,
right.
to some extent, might not still be a Christian majority country.
Yeah,
I didn't specify. That's why I didn't specify. But I can use one concrete example, which is Turkey.
Okay, don't go into Turkey quite yet, because
it's an example where this was
right.
used in favour of the Muslim majority against the minority.
The questions about would you censor anything?
Nothing that we have spoken about comes remotely close to my test for what would need to be censored. is the best answer. Is the best answer I can think. Not even remotely. It doesn't even begin to register on what I think would might need to be censored. And we could then start, if we really wanted to, on the academic exercise. And incidentally, since it was raised, we don't have a law here about Holocaust denial, and I'm glad that we don't. And I would perfectly happily support people who didn't want a law in other countries while understanding why it existed. And there are some people I know who would be quite cross with me for taking that view and so on. But you can see why such a campaign has not many people prepared to campaign for it.
Tom, would you like to react to that question? I'm going to the audience next. You don't have to. The question was, would you censor anything?
No, I think that freedom of speech is fundamental, and even the right to question freedom.
We haven't mentioned child pornography, which is usually one everybody's on until you get to the boundaries of what's art and what's porn.
We have laws in this country against incitement to hatred, religious and racial, and there's been people who've suggested that this film, if it was made in the UK, would potentially have fallen foul of those laws. So I think there is some grounds for that, even within our legislation.
I think it's really unlikely, by the way.
Yeah, I don't think it would.
But the point is that the principle is accepted that you can incite towards hatred, and that is something that can be criminalised.
You've got to show a direct link to violence.
But should be criminalised.
But nobody on the panel has even suggested there might even be a grounds for this. I'm saying that there are legal grounds in this country,
but
which
not
some
in
have
America.
argued
Well,
for.
I think that's
Can I just make
great
one other quick point?
I
think nobody on the panel, apart from Miriam, is trying to understand the sense of affront to identity in the Muslim world, and I'll use that phrase anyway, which is at the root cause of this. And you can all talk about the fact that there is a sense of victimhood which is unjustified, and we should work against it. And I think the work Margie is doing is great, and we should continue that. But unless you actually address that core issue, it's going to happen again, and there will be a violent reaction. So rather than talk about the principle of free speech...
That's fine. I think you should talk a bit more about what an affront to identity is.
Well, if you think about the way that Muslims have been discriminated against since 9/11, you understand...
No, sorry. Please don't go on about discrimination. Tell me what an affront...
Well, if you were a Muslim, you might know about discrimination.
Can I possibly...
I'm not trying to trap you. I'm honestly trying to explore the area.
What I'm saying is that if you, as a Muslim since 9/11, had to go through extra security checks every time you went through an airport, if you were pulled for random screening every time you went through an airport, you might understand that.
Keep the microphone. Miriam, would you like to respond?
Not an answer.
If I could just bring in Saba Mahmood, who's an academic from Princeton, I believe, and she's actually talked about the definition of what a moral injury might be. And she talks about one of the areas that there's misunderstanding in with regards to blasphemy in the Muslim world is that Muslims model their behavior on Prophet Muhammad. That's what is central to Muslim identity. So an insult, if you like, to Prophet Muhammad is not a theoretical insult. It is an insult that is felt to the inner core of the self. And
but
so
that
she
depends
says...
what version of Muhammad you're talking about, doesn't it?
No.
There are many versions.
Miriam,
of
will you finish your point to the gentleman who raised you up?
Yeah, so the point is that if moral injury is felt in a different way, I think, with regards to Muslims, and I think it is, I think blasphemy is misunderstood with regards to how Muslims feel it. That is to say, if insulting Muhammad insults the inner core of individual Muslims, it's different to yourself, your sense of self.
The biography of Muhammad is like a Rubik's Cube that you can twist, and
what
you can
has
sort
this
of...
got to do with the biography of Muhammad?
Right,
It's got
everything to do with it, because if you're offended...
Hold on, panel. Would you restate your question?
I'll try it in a different way. Personally, I actually disagree with Miriam that the religious belief is at the core of this. I think it's about identity. It's about a community of Muslims who feel victimised.
Right, different from when a film came out in the 60s, mocking the Christianity. This is different. Muslims feel it worse.
Well, I think Christians will feel offended as well. The difference is, and people might disagree with Miriam's description, if you look at Muslims across the world, they feel a sense of injustice.
Sorry, I'm just going to...
You go next.
And they do have violent protests in reaction to that film.
I actually don't disagree with the analysis that for those majority of Muslims demonstrating in countries like Pakistan, they felt their identity was under attack. I mean, that's just stating the obvious. I don't disagree with that. My point on this panel isn't to state the obvious, it's to try and say, what should we as reasonable Muslims who understand that this had nothing to do, this had nothing to do with us, that there was some amateur filmmaker in America in the corner of some obscure town making this film, how should we react? You know, that's different to how my dad wants everyone. So he feels like his identity was
really agree with that, and that's my question back to you, because we were talking about this an hour ago. You know, what was going on? There was it seems, possibly a planned al-Qaeda attack in Benghazi. There's a lot going on in terms of internal Libyan politics, disagreement between political and religious groups, internal Egyptian politics and things going on there. And yet you're telling me, and you're now agreeing, that this is all about affront to identity and it's a simple thing,
what is it? That basically, you've got a minority of agitators agitators out there who are able to whip up the crowds. And my point is, why were the crowds responding? Not everyone who demonstrated was an Islamist, but the Islamists were whipping them up. Right. And why they were responding is because they were able to be whipped up because they felt they were under attack. But that doesn't justify the action.
That's not why. Because they're bored and you know,
So-
it's fun.
so-
I mean, that is a crucial part of it.
We're going
but these Arabs, they just get bored and riot.
Well, you know, why were people rioting in London last year? You know, that was an element.
We're going to the back of the room. We're going to the back of the room. Yes,
poverty, unemployment, racism.
Can we hear from the audience? It's a public meeting.
Sorry, when we in the West rob nations of their resources, what left? You know, what do the poor people have left but to protest in this manner? You know, they have no right to the lifestyle that we have here in the West through the resources that we tend to exploit in other nations. So I kind of feel I'm with you know, those people that are protesting in those nations, because I tell you what, if I had oil, if I had the lifestyle that I've got here, I certainly wouldn't protest.
And we have to balance that, because there's no link between the Taliban punishing a man for not growing a beard and the West invading Iraq. There's absolutely no link. Why should he grow a beard just because America invaded Iraq? Why should a woman be forced to cover her hair just because America invaded Iraq and be lashed in public because America invaded Iraq in some region called Swat in Pakistan, where she's whipped in public? There is extremism, which is unrelated to foreign policy. We have to acknowledge that. I'm trying to carve a middle path.
But I think there's two different points going on here. One is that there, and it was what you were talking about much earlier, that there is, for a mixture of reasons, a high degree of anti-Americanism in a number of countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. I was looking at the latest American Pew survey results just because of coming here this evening, and the levels of support for Obama and approval of Obama or the American government are very low and have fallen in the last 3 years.
Lower than Bush in some areas.
But if you ask those same countries their views of the American public or American culture, they're actually much higher. And
Or
so
globalization.
that's fine. So these people want to protest for whatever reasons against American foreign policy. But what's that got to do with censorship and the problem with the video?
We're going to move on to concluding thoughts in a moment. We're still on reactions in the West. I hope that's where your question is.
So yes, reactions in the West and the responsibility of the media. My name's Katie Engelhardt. I'm with freespeechdebate.com. We're talking a lot about people and groups of people that we can't control. So if we're looking at the responsibility of us, most of us as Western journalists, the concern to me is one of self-censorship. I'm most worried that we're going to self-censor because of these kinds of protests. And we already are. On our website, we interviewed formerly of the BBC, Mark Thompson, earlier this year. He talked about his decision not to air Jerry Springer the Opera on his network, and the reason he gave was that he was, to air Jerry Springer the Opera. What he said is he wouldn't have aired a show that denigrated the Prophet Muhammad. Jerry Springer the Opera, for those of you who don't know, shows kind of a feminine Jesus prancing around in a diaper. Mark Thompson said he wouldn't have shown similar images of the Prophet Muhammad because of concern about the safety of minorities in Britain. I find that very troubling.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that we have to be also very careful. A lot of Muslims draw a distinction between gratuitously attacking Islam and academic criticism. But the problem is in art, it's not so easy to draw that distinction, because was Life of Brian gratuitous, or was it genuinely inquiring about certain points, about the life of Christ? And so I think we have to err on the side of free speech always, and we have to, as Muslims, defend the right of free speech, even when it's uncomfortable for us, because if we don't, then everyone else feels they're under siege.
Can I give you warning, everyone, that we're 20 minutes away from the close, and I've got one subject change, and then we have our concluding thoughts. Do I hear from you all a return to some very fundamental principles? Can I put it to you like this and ask for your reaction on the panel and in the room? The internet has broken down barriers between societies that have moved less in the direction of freedom of speech and democracy than others. And we are living in a world where you, David, have said you think we in the West need to revisit what we think is blasphemous. We have to go back to first principles. We have to have more free speech. Can I ask you if behind the issue of this video, which was rubbish, and no one ever saw it and it led to death, are you seeing changes in the West should happen which really test us all on what we think it's appropriate? Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yeah, let me just take something which has got nothing to do with blasphemy, which was the jailing of the guy for 56 days for his incredibly unpleasant remarks on Twitter to people on the case of Fabrice Mwamba. I don't think we can carry on doing that. I don't think we can put people in jail for tweeting stuff unless it passes a very substantial harm test, because there is so much of this going on. In the end, we are going to get ourselves in a terrible state of it. In fact, I think we're already there. We've got to work out new protocols for how we deal with each other, and we are going to have to be a hell of a lot less bloody touchy, frankly, because this is the only way we're going to get through it.
Tom? Yeah, I mean, speaking as someone who went through a Twitter storm, a lot of the tweets that I got were when I got them, very unsettling, very alarming, and I sort of bruised for a few hours, but then it sort of died down. And on reflection, I suspect that what these violent tweets tell us is not anything about the clash of civilizations or the inherent intolerance of the religious or anything like that. It's telling us that there are a lot of very intemperate people on Twitter, and they now have the opportunity to express their intemperance.
And tell you directly.
And the rules have changed, and all of us have to adjust to that. That we are going to get insulted more.
It is the privilege, and I'll say it again, of the majority to tell ethnic or religious minorities what they should or shouldn't get offended about. Let me just finish. A friend of mine, actually, in the wake of that, we were talking about whether he felt that it was contributing, this particular tweet could contribute to an atmosphere in which black people could be insulted using derogatory names more commonly. And he felt concerned that it could, particularly in the light of recent allegations that the police are involved in racism, that racism seems to be not so much post-racial Britain, but still very much racialized Britain. And so in that sense, it really is slightly arrogant to my mind for us as a majority to sit around telling minorities what they should or shouldn't be offended about. We need to listen to them and listen to what they're saying about what offends them. Now, that doesn't mean you need to legislate about that, but it does mean that there are areas on which our sensitivities, the sensitivities of minorities, should be taken into consideration.
There is nothing that one of us is not a minority member of, or a discriminated member of, or have been.
You were talking about black people. I'm not talking about black people. I'm talking about at one time or another. We have all been insulted on Twitter. One of the things that Tom learned as a historian is what we as journalists have been getting, public journalists, have been getting for a very long time. It's part of the warp and weft of the new kind of public debate. Now, I can say to people, I wish you were more civil. I believe in civility, and I believe in civil discourse and so on. But I don't believe in banging up the uncivil until they have learned my degree of civility. I don't think anyone suggested they did, but there's been a backlash on trolling.
So we are banging them up.
So I hope I'm accepted by you as sitting here as a minority Muslim speaking, and I believe I have the right to tell Muslims not to be offended by this film whatsoever. And I think I think that actually my identities are multiple, and I would hope that you're not just. And I think you're not just sitting here speaking as a Muslim.
I'm not speaking as a Muslim at all.
So I'd hope you're speaking also as a
right.
So let me finish. Yeah. I hope you're also speaking as a defender of human rights and civil liberties, because I'm more offended.
Is it because I'm Muslim that I need to say that?
No, let me finish. I'm more offended by global calls that have arisen after this film to introduce a global blasphemy law than I am about the film having happened. Because I think a global blasphemy law would be more devastating for human rights around the world, devastating for minorities that you're so concerned about in countries like Egypt and Pakistan, where minorities are slaughtered because they have the audacity to challenge the majority Sunni population on sectarian petty issues and get killed for them, or other Sunnis who stand up and say they have the right to challenge you, and then they get killed for saying that and get accused of blasphemy for challenging a blasphemy law.
Agree.
So I think what I'm more offended by, and I think that all minorities should be offended by, is blasphemy law, because the first people to suffer from blasphemy laws will be minorities.
I don't agree with that.
I actually want to answer your question, which was, are we in a new world, especially with the digital world, that we could all publish, it can go everywhere? And I think my answer is mixed. It's kind of, well, yes and no. Of course, that instant access is actually a wonderful thing in many ways in terms of free expression, and it's new. But in other ways, I mean, there was always the Silk Road and globalization and ideas spreading and knowledge spreading and ideas clashing. So we have been here before in many ways down the centuries. And I was interested in what you were saying about asking people not to be offended. I'm not asking anybody to not be offended. be offended, and I'll be offended about things, but I won't ask you to give up your right to free expression. And I think we're getting much less tolerant of being offended, and that's a huge problem.
Can I pick you up on that, and everyone in the room? It's 20 years ago tonight, that Sinead O'Connor appeared on Saturday Night Live. She was booked to sing, and she ripped up a picture of the Pope, and it happened on the 3rd of October 20 years ago. Do you on the panel and in the room think that that would be possible tonight? Could I go on television and do that in Britain? Could I do that?
Not and keep your job at the BBC.
Could I? Well, let's just do.
And actually, I'd probably support the right of the BBC to fire you if you did do it, but I wouldn't support their right to put you in prison for it.
So, I mean, my general question is: the trend, is it against offending anyone? Because we do have a culture of sensitivity. Would you like to go first?
Yeah. So, if you sang "Nothing Compares to You" and then ripped up the poster, perhaps you'd be safe. No.
No singing.
What's the question? The question is, have we regressed?
Have we regressed? That's my question to the room.
I think people are adjusting to the fact that Christianity can be criticised in this way. I myself have watched Life of Brian and have laughed at the film. I think that sadly, what's happening because of geopolitical factors and Islamist political interests, that it's become a lot more difficult to do that with Islam because of the combination of identity, foreign policy grievances, and the agitation by extremists. And I think that to solve that problem, all of those factors need to be addressed. We do need to start looking at invading countries. We do need to start looking at respecting people's identities and the rise of the anti-Islam far right. But we also seriously need to start looking at Muslims, need to start looking at the extremism within their own ranks, because frankly, there have been left-wing activists in this country for years challenging fascism, challenging racism. Sadly, there aren't too many Muslims out there currently challenging Islamist extremism.
So the gentleman who asked us to look to identity questions, you want him to be more insulted in Britain in the next few years, or to be prepared to be more insulted? The gentleman there said...
Oh, I mean, I know him. I'm sure he'd agree that he's not going to sort of, these cartoons, more's going to happen. I mean, he's a very responsible man. In fact, if he knew what he does, you'd be quite impressed.
But do you want him to be prepared to be more upset and more offended? And do you want me...
Yeah, I think he's already prepared. I think, I won't speak on your behalf, but I think you're reconciled to the fact that someone's going to make another movie somewhere at some time. Okay. That's not your point.
All right, so the gentleman behind, and then anyone else in the room on this question, this trend I've raised, and then we'll go to some concluding remarks from the panel and you. The gentleman next to you, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can't we just consider, in relation to the problem of increasing sensitivity, I do believe we have regressed, that we say free speech, you will have the right of reply, we make it clear you will have the right to reply, and we reserve the right to ask you awkward questions, and if you don't answer them, we can draw our own conclusions.
How do you do that to the lunatic who made this film in California? I mean, just some stupid little person with a video.
Well, exactly.
How do I get hold of him?
Well, give him the right of reply, and then counter-reply to him, because, as you say, he's a lunatic and his own stupidity will see him out.
Right, elsewhere in the room, you've all come tonight burning to talk about this, so we'll move on now to concluding remarks. The question that brought everyone here tonight was nearly 24 years after the publication of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. Does the debate about freedom of expression, religious sensibilities remain the same? Is it time for a wider discussion within Muslim communities and the West? David?
I think I've more or less answered the question in the way that I want to, which is, I think on this question, the locus lies within the Muslim communities themselves, which is essentially forging a way of dealing with the way in which the world is increasingly becoming, which actually makes sense to them and makes sense for the rest of us.
Miriam?
Because, and I'll just reiterate the point I made, we actually can't go in any other direction. Unfortunately, whether you like it or not, we can't go in any other direction.
My concluding remark will be a quote from Sabah Mahmood, actually, and that is, I think the future of the Muslim minority in Europe depends not so much on how the law might be expanded to accommodate its concerns, but on a larger transformation of the cultural and ethical sensibilities in the majority population that undergird the law.
Well, would you like to, can you
silence on that one?
Can you put that in your own words? Because I didn't listen to it. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, that
I could
have repeated it, but no. Essentially, I don't think there's any need for any transformation of the law. I think there are sufficient laws in place. I think what's much more important, and what your previous question was alluding to, in fact, to me, is teething problems in an increasingly multicultural society. That is, in a diverse society, how do we manage the different sensibilities of different parts of society? And a responsible democratic society will move towards a better representation of all those sides. So my point was that it's not about legislating. It's about, if you like, expanding the accommodation of the concerns of different sections of society, and that has to be done by the majority.
And do you want people within Muslim communities to have a bigger debate about the freedoms that we all have to step on?
Yes, but you know, I mean, that's the yes.
You do?
The short answer is yes. We're a long way off being in a great place, but...
Yeah, I mean, Miriam's a feminist, and she knows about that as well. I mean, I want to congratulate her on her women's rights work and rights work that she does. I would say conclude my remarks by saying that I stand against, whether they be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, black, white, yellow, pink, people that call for blasphemy, and I stand with Muslims, Jews, Christians, black, white and pink people that basically want to defend free speech and civil liberties. And I think it's unhealthy if we turn this into a discussion about how Muslims are offended vis-a-vis everyone else. It's actually about free speech and civil liberties and about the fact that these are under attack at the moment. And they're under attack not just by Muslim extremists, but also by fascists and far-right extremists. Those are the battle lines we should be, and that's the identity that we should be representing here, and that's what should offend us, that these cherished liberties that people have died for to defend are under attack.
I think that's right. I think if we tried to stop everybody in the world being offended by something, we would not be able to say anything. I absolutely believe you have to have free expression to defend other rights. And whether we're talking about Arab Spring or the East European revolutions or revolution in Nepal, people around the world again and again and again show they want freedom and free speech. And to say we mustn't offend and must censor is quite wrong and highly offensive. So.
I think that for the past 300 years, the absolutist claims of Christianity have been eroded by the claims of science, by historical criticism, lately by mockery. And that's been a painful process for Christians, and it's taken 300 years. Muslims are now going through that same process. And the process of weathering is going to change and transform Western Islam. The Western form of Islam will be a different faith to that of Pakistan or the Middle East. But it is, of course, a painful and grueling experience.
Yeah, I don't think that it should be. I don't think it should be censored, and I think it's important that when people do put things on the internet, that we can judge ourselves and realise that it's a lot of crap that most people talk.
Right. Okay. And although you think that, when it was done a month ago, at least nearly 50 people died, and so that's what is happening. That is what is happening. If you, heaven forbid, want to put up a video on the internet tonight, you're not going to be a very safe man.
No, I know that, but I wouldn't do it. But like,
good.
But
probably wouldn't want to.
I think we're in an age now where it's so easy to do that. How can we stop it anyway? And if people wanted to do it, then they are going to do it, but it's up to us, like David said, we've got to be thick-skinned and just, rise above it.
But you're not a Muslim, are you?
No.
So how can you be thick-skinned about this video, because it's not attacking your identity?
I'm just talking about a lot of videos, in general, or
sure,
whatever.
there's a lot of videos attacking your
identity. We've got videos that do attack your identity. We'll show them to you.
You've mentioned the deaths several. The video did not cause the deaths.
Finally, Chris, quick bounce around the room. We're very much at the end. Did anyone come bursting to hear something discussed that was not? No. Fine. In that case, can I just thank... Yes.
The question I asked you. The politics of theocracy.
The politics of theocracy.
David is absolutely right. I proposed to Ken Roth at Human Rights Watch and to your predecessor, Andrew Shetty at Amnesty, that the West should adopt, as with capital punishment, a principle of absolute ban on censorship, including espionage, and that's where we're going. But that doesn't answer the question inside Islam, which is what's going on in the succession struggles, the way the mullahs operate in Iran and the way Morsi is operating in the politics, is playing this thing and trying to create state-defended principles, constitutional principles of freedom of speech. That can't come from us. It has to come from inside Islam.
Okay.
And that is a complete contradiction. We have a kind of convergence theory that's going on.
All right. Thank you for that point from the floor. It's right that it should end with the audience, because it is a public meeting. But thank you all very much. I heard from the very beginning a lot of things new. I was asked to look about anti-Americanism to understand the phrase of the Muslim world. You've been the subject of a Twitter storm. You've been in prison for 4 years. You've been attacked on the internet. And I've learned a great deal. And thank you, everyone, and to our panel. Thank you very much indeed.